Starting this weekend in the German Alpine resort of Elmau, leaders of the G7 will meet. They've invited extra guests to participate, including Indian Prime Minister Modi, underscoring the country's growing geostrategic role in the world. Here at DW, we've been working on a series looking at India's rise. It's called India's Dilemma, and you'll find it on our DW News YouTube page. Here's a quick look.
India finds itself in a dramatic geopolitical squeeze. Russia, its old friend and arms supplier, is deepening ties with China, weakened by the war and becoming subservient to a power that's no friend to India.
There are serious concerns in New Delhi about whether Russia will continue to be a reliable supplier.
At the same time, China's threat to India becomes ever more apparent, compelling India to reinforce its borders against attempts to take its territory.
So the Chinese are breathing down our borders, and they've just killed our soldiers less than 2 years ago.
And Delhi faces deep dilemmas over how close to get to the West.
The US has had many alliances. Not all of them have fared very well.
India has a long tradition of avoiding close alliances and preferring to stay non-aligned. But the war is forcing it to think again about all of its relationships and face up to some choices it hasn't had to make before. In part one of this video, we'll look at how durable India's old friendship with Russia really is, and whether it can survive Moscow's new path.
The Russia relationship is now in a position where it really does need to be rethought.
In part two, we'll see how tensions between India and China are far more dangerous than the rest of the world realizes. Think about this. Beijing even says that it should control an entire Indian state. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it's all too easy to imagine a devastating war.
So we are talking about a very big section of the world, a very important part of the world, a very large armies, nuclear armed countries fighting each other.
And in part three, we'll ask whether India and the West can really come together, or if they're ultimately heading in very different directions.
When China attacked us, where was this degree of outrage from Europe or from other countries?
India is coming to resemble Russia and China far more than it resembles Western democracies.
So as the world enters this dangerous new era, India could be the deciding factor. So no matter where you are in the world, the choices made here in Delhi matter to you.
Be sure to go online and catch the full series. And we have Richard Walker, Chief International Editor and the series correspondent with us. Richard, let's talk about India and this upcoming G7 summit. And I want to start by playing a clip from U.S. President Joe Biden.
I think that the relationship between India and the United States, the largest democracies in the world, is destined to be stronger, closer, and tighter, and I think it can benefit the whole world.
Right. And then I want to play a clip from Shashi Tharoor, Indian parliamentarian and former diplomat.
Would I want India to publicly declare itself an ally of a country? I'm not even sure I'm ready to bite that bullet, because the word alliance implies to some degree a mortgaging of your freedom to make your own decisions.
So it sounds like the two countries are talking past each other?
Yeah, it can sometimes seem like that, Melissa. I mean, you certainly get a strong sense from the Americans, and on my recent trip to Delhi, I got this very strongly, that they would like to tie India closer into the kind of Western-led sort of what they see as an alliance of kind of liberal democracies, which is really sort of girding up for this sort of pushback against the autocracies of China and Russia. And you do often get this sense that India is sort of going along with it to some extent, but playing almost like hard to get in some ways. And there are historical reasons for that. Like, India has this very long history since independence of non-alignment, not wanting to throw all of its eggs in one basket with any one country. So trying to sort of stress, and what the kind of language they talk about now is wanting like the world to be multipolar, that they don't want to kind of get dragged into a sort of new Cold War sort of scenario. But the Americans certainly trying to coax them in with, you know, formats like the Quad, you know, this regional grouping in Asia, with the Americans, with Japan, with Australia and India, trying to sort of say, India, you're a big democracy, you belong with us.
Okay, so they're part of the Quad, but in terms of Russia, though, to what extent will the leaders of the G7 be able to convince India to reorient its policy?
Well, certainly India's been under a lot of pressure already to try to put some distance between itself and Russia over the war that Russia has launched in Ukraine. India has really pretty steady, all right from the beginning, been clear that, or trying to take what they see as a kind of principled, independent position of saying that they call for a ceasefire, that they condemn violence, but not really coming out and really making a break with Russia. For instance, at the United Nations, in the United Nations Security Council just after the war began, they famously did not vote against the Russians. They abstained.
Right.
And the Indian message back on Russia, to some extent, to the West, is sort of just don't lecture us. And there are various different angles to that. Partly, you know, people will say, well, it's the West that's been starting wars in the last 20 years. What are you lecturing us about? What's so different about this one? Also on energy, with, you know, Western countries trying to tell India, don't start buying Russian energy while we're trying to sanction it. And the Indians saying, well, we have a very poor population. We owe it to our population to get energy as cheaply as we can.
And there are some criticisms that actually, or observations that India is actually much more closer politically with Russia and China.
Yeah, well, this is the other side of the story, because on the one hand, the West is very keen to bind India closer. On the other hand, they're concerned about what's happening in India, about the illiberal direction that Indian democracy is moving in. And we spoke to some critical voices also as part of this film while we were in India. And maybe we can cue up a soundbite from Harchos Singh Bal. He's the political editor of a prominent kind of intellectual news magazine there.
India is coming to resemble Russia and China far more than it resembles Western democracies. So the West will have to deal with this country through very hard-nosed means, rather than by thinking that this common shared value of constitutional democracy is going to pull India into our sphere. That is not true.
Yeah, so what Harchos Singh Bal is saying there is that this idea of the West that it's trying to appeal to India to join this kind of democratic pushback of sort of on values basis against China and Russia, that's not going to work, because India is maybe not moving in this kind of liberal direction that India has. For instance, there's very severe criticism of India's treatment of its Muslim minorities, and other concerns about the direction that Indian democracy is taking. So very interesting to see how this dynamic between India and the West plays out.
Richard Walker, thank you so much for joining us in the studio.